thanks for reaching out to me. This is a great pleasure because I just mentioned this before. We're always giving presentations somewhere inside our schools, in our nucleus, and somewhere else in the world. We travel long distances, but we never really walk over the road to the next building. And so we always stick in our own mindsets and don't learn anything new. So I'm very appreciative. I'm an economist who looks at non-cognitive skill development and other skills. And I'm aware of that economists are not the only ones looking at these issues. And we may title it differently. So when I talk today about non-cognitive skill development, I probably talk about personality development or soft skill development or life skill development or character traits development. So there's many different expressions for what you could coin these terms. But for simplicity, I will talk about non-cognitive skills development. I tell you in a second what I mean by this. And I have been invited to present some of our recently published paper on the role of university education in non-cognitive skill development. And usually I do not present work that has just been forthcoming in peer-reviewed journals. And the reason is that when you get feedback, you can't really implement it anymore. And so whatever feedback or criticism you have, I have no chance to change that in the journal. But I'm happy to reach out because I have a whole research program at the Charles Perkins Center, where I lead the Economics of Human Development research node. And please allow me to do a little bit of advertising for the type of work I'm doing there, because this could lead to a couple of collaborations between us as well. So I'm concerned with human development. That's everything that happens over the life course, perfectly from birth into from birth into the deathbed, but it's not quite that long of a time period that I'm looking at. But so I do quite a lot of basic research on the dynamic properties of cognitive skills, non-cognitive skills, preferences, mental health, physical health, because I consider all of these part of human development or child development. And we do know that these evolve sometime, in very early childhood, some even say already in the womb. There are certain processes or milestones that we know from the child development literature how these evolve. But surprisingly, we don't really know what these dynamics are in an empirical setting. There are theoretical ideas about this. And there's quite a lot we know in certain age groups over shorter time periods, but empirically we know very little about these processes. So I would say the last 8 years I have produced quite a lot of research studies that looked especially into these non-cognitive skill developments at various ages of the life course and economic preferences and of mental health and physical health. And not only this, I also looked at the socioeconomic gradients in these, how these developments differ by groups that are, according to our definitions, more vulnerable or disadvantaged or less vulnerable or less disadvantaged. And this research program has led me over the years to ask, well, is there a role of public policy in shaping human development? And maybe for you this is a very obvious question to ask. Well, among economists it hasn't been a very obvious question. So I do ask, is there a role for welfare policy, how and how much welfare payments we make, or family assistance payments, which are all payments that may assist parents in the home, and that also means indirectly how they are raising their children and building up all of these aspects of human development. We've also some papers on the role of medical care or early life medical interventions that prevent early life physical or mental health problems, and that may have future returns. And last but not least, and maybe most importantly for today, the role of the education sector in shaping human development. So you may have seen maybe some of my recent work, some working papers have made quite a lot of headlines because we evaluated the impact of income management in the Northern Territory that targeted directly indigenous communities and what effect that has had on on school attendance and health outcomes of children. And we found that these had these negative impacts. These were proper causal evaluations. And so this is the type of work I'm doing at the moment. We have also early life medical care, special care nurseries, babies that are sent early to special care nurseries. We found a way to causally identify this, and there we can look at the human capital or the human development of indigenous and non-indigenous children in the Northern Territory. And the education sector is maybe the work where I have least competence overall, and the reason is because I have really only 3 studies on this. So one I present today, the role of university education on cognitive skill development. I have also some work on preschool attendance in the Northern Territory for Indigenous children, and then an overview article that I'm going to present today also to give you some insights from what we know about the impact of secondary and tertiary education on non-cognitive skill development. Okay? And last but not least, I have invested quite heavily in the last years in building a data infrastructure that allows us to answer some of these questions in the public policy space. So I've become a chief investigator in 2 large NHMRC projects that collated administrative data on children in the Northern Territory and in South Australia. So one is a Centre for Research Excellence, and the other one is a partnership project where we put together perinatal data, immunization data, preschool data, school attendance data, NAPLAN achievement test data, hospitalization data, juvenile justice data, and hospitalization data, among others, so that we can study the human development of children born as they go through the public system. Okay. But also I've worked quite a lot on the question on how do we measure these non-cognitive skills. It's a quite tricky bit. In economics, where we look at economic preferences like attitudes towards risk or our shadow of the future or our ability to deal with ambiguity, we have task-based measures where we do little experiments with our students or with adults. But in the personality space, we don't really have that. There are some studies that try to derive personality measures, for instance, from the accuracy of clocks or the walking speed of individuals to measure conscientiousness, but unless you tell me otherwise, I'm under the impression there's very little. So we have started looking into the side products from survey processes. It's so-called metadata that you collect in the or paradata in the survey collection process, that you can find measures of conscientiousness, for instance, or cognitive abilities, just as a side product, the way how people respond to nationally representative surveys. Yeah. And we do also a little bit on statistical methods. Okay. But now I have made enough advertisement for myself, so now I present some of the results you're more interested in. So non-cognitive skills. With some of you had just an informal discussion just before. This could be almost anything. I think there is so many different definitions of personality traits or character traits or non-cognitive skills, as you want to term them. I focus in my research on the following. So the big 5 personality traits, which is maybe one of the oldest and most general inventories to measure personality at the most general level. It goes back to research over the last 100 years. So you would have extroversion, so the degree of sociability, agreeableness, it's somehow we economists would say your sense of contributing to a social good, or your altruism, or to agree with others and to collaborate with others. Openness to experience is often with respect to how open are you to new cultures and cultural experiences. Neuroticism, sometimes also termed in opposite emotional stability, is whether you have feelings of whether you're jealous or you're jumping in your moods. Could be negative, and some say there is a literature in the big 5 personality space of, for instance, Walding and co-authors who say that, for instance, neuroticism is a good measure or a good flag for measuring personality disorders. And conscientiousness. And conscientiousness is sometimes termed as the super trait because there has been so much research on the predictive power of conscientiousness in health outcomes, health behaviors, performance in the classroom or in the labor market. Then there is grit. This is the latest, the latest super trait. Angela Duckworth has coined that. That's really your ability to run a marathon, to stick with it, to just the perseverance to jump through all the hurdles that are set up in life for you. And she's studying this with respect to success of children. And then there is locus of control, or sometimes also referred to self-efficacy. So this is the Rutter's idea of your beliefs about whether the most important outcomes in your life, that you can shape them. So it's really an attitude about the probability that if you make an effort, that this has a positive or some negative outcome. So to give you an example, so someone with an internal locus of control would be a person who believes, if I study really hard for that exam, I will have a very good grade, or have a higher probability of a good grade. Someone with an external locus of control, extreme external locus of control, would attach a 0 probability to that you can influence your grades with some investment in studying. Okay. Today, most of what I'm saying today is about the big 5 personality traits, because these are the non-cognitive skills we have looked at in the study you had shown an interest in. But I have worked a lot on locus of control, so I have lots of studies on this. And I have now recently also started working on grit, because we have started collecting data on first-year students at the University of Sydney who started in 2015. We've conducted a survey on them, and then we merged the whole survey information with administrative data from their achievement, so the grade point averages basically in other aspects. And so we have a first draft of that paper ready. So there we look also at grit. But I can tell you, as I mentioned, that informally already, grit is not as predictive of your grade point averages than your ATA. The ATA is really the best, kind of the best measure. We were kind of disappointed about this. And we also looked at, in this study, how grit and conscientiousness moderates the impact of your socioeconomic status on your grade point averages, because we see this quite strongly. Children who come from more education disadvantaged backgrounds, who are, for instance, the first in their family to go to university, they have lower grade point averages. And we wanted to see whether some of these non-cognitive skills are moderating this impact of socioeconomic disadvantage. And grit does not do this, but conscientiousness does that. So very conscientious children from socioeconomic disadvantaged backgrounds have higher grade point averages than comparable students who have lower conscientiousness levels. Okay, but today we will look at these. But in my portfolio, there's many more studies that look at other non-cognitive skills. So let's talk about education, generally the role of education in non-cognitive skill development. What you see here is a summary of only correlation coefficients that I had produced for an overview article that I had written for the IZA World of Labor. So the IZA is the key network of labor economists in my area. And they have a new journal, a policy journal called World of Labor, so where you write a very brief investigation about one topic. And I had written an article about what's the role of the secondary and the tertiary education sector on building these non-cognitive skills. And that was quite novel, because there's a lot of research on the primary and the preschool education sector. So lots of studies, everything that stems out of the peri-preschool, for instance, the peri-preschool work, and in other countries. So preschool is really a very important policy topic, but there's actually a lot of activity in this space. So what I've done here first to show you is the first question what I wanted to answer was, well, what's the link between, let's say, years of education and these non-cognitive skills as we observe them in the Household Income and Labour Dynamics Survey of Australia, which is a nationally representative survey. And in that survey we have 3 and for other non-cognitive skills 4 measurement periods of these non-cognitive skills. And all I've done here is these are unadjusted correlation coefficients between years of education, which is like a summary measure for your level of education, and these non-cognitive skills. And here we have openness to experience, risk tolerance, future orientation, internal locus of control, conscientiousness, emotional stability, extroversion, and agreeableness. And you see the strongest raw correlation is between openness to experience and these years of education. This is here termed in terms of standard deviation change. So everything I talk about is in terms of standard deviation difference from the mean. And I'm doing this because most of these studies present them in terms of standard deviation difference. And then you see so individuals who are very open to experience have higher levels of education. People who are very risk tolerant have higher level of education. And you could argue, yeah, in order to invest in your education, it's a risk that you're taking. It's an investment because you don't know how well this will pay off. And some are saying the university degree may not be worth its money and the time because the opportunity costs are very high. Future-oriented individuals have more levels of education. That's very intuitive. Individuals with internal locus of control have higher levels of education. We've seen this elsewhere in the literature. And the argument is because someone with an internal locus of control believes if I have this degree, I can get a higher wage job. And there is a quite famous paper by Coleman and Dallaire in the Journal of Human Resources in 2003 who have shown this theoretically and then empirically. Okay, but very little correlation between extroversion and sociability type of measure and agreeableness in education. And we have seen this previously in the data where we look at the dynamics of the big 5 personality traits and locus of control. So I have several papers on this in adolescence and adulthood where we look over 1-year time periods, 4-year time periods and 8-year time periods and determinants at age 32 from other data sets that agreeableness and extroversion is the big 5 personality trait that can be the least explained through predictors. In general, you know, if you just put it as a level on one side and then throw in all the predictors, it can be the least explained. Okay, and in this article, I had also reviewed, and this is a complicated like a very complicated, I think it's a complicated graph, but I tried to summarize what we know from the literature about the impact of anything that happens in the secondary or the tertiary education sector on non-cognitive skill development in a causal way. So where you can really make the claim this is causal. Because of the exposure to this, you get this higher non-cognitive skills or lower non-cognitive skills. So you would have really a proper natural experiment set up where you have a convincing control group. And what you see here is 11 studies that I've identified. So I started writing this in 2015, I think, and only got it, I think it took me 2 years to review this because this was a very complicated literature, I realized, because you see below here, there's all these different non-cognitive skill measures that these studies looked at. Some looked at the big 5, others used the growth mindset, the Carol Dweck concept, grit, risk tolerance, self-esteem, self-control, which I hadn't mentioned before, locus of control, and administrative measures. So some economists say, well, if we don't measure non-cognitive skills, maybe we can use suspensions in school as a non-cognitive skill measure because it has nothing to do with your ability to sit an exam, but rather your behavior in the classroom. This is questionable, but you know, in the absence of better measures, you can try and convince a referee of this. And what you see here is, you see here the treatment effects identified in this literature of a specific treatment on a non-cognitive skill measure measured in terms of standard deviations away from the mean. And what you see above here were my own calculations that you've seen on the slide before, just years of education with non-cognitive skills. And each one of these different symbols represents a different non-cognitive skills that I'm placing down here. And there's 3 things I want you to take away from this. So once you look down in proper policy evaluation literature with causal effects, there's only a few studies. There's lots of correlation studies, but by the time in 2017 this was published, I found 11 in total. And some were just working papers at that time. Second, you see all of these different non-cognitive skill measures, as I mentioned before. And third, both the sign and the magnitude of these effects found in this literature is very different. There's a huge variation. Some of these programs had negative impacts on non-cognitive skill development. Some of these programs, or at least what was considered as a treatment in this literature, has huge impacts of 0.7 standard deviation here for self-esteem in a study by Heckman, Stixhut, and Urzur, which was published in 2006 in the Journal of Labor Economics, which was the literature in my area that really triggered this whole research in non-cognitive skill development. And then you see a lot of variation. What you don't see here is standard deviations, or the confidence intervals, and it was just too messy. Most of these are not significant that you're seeing here. So, and I walk you through 3 important results, otherwise I don't have enough time. So what you see here is this most famous paper by Heckman, Stixhut, and Urzur, who used the NLSY in the United States. And they had a structural equation model, so they had some form of causal identification here. And then they looked both, how does education determine these non-cognitive skills? And then later, and also how do non-cognitive skills affect later life labor market outcomes and health outcomes. Okay, and what they find is, so they had a self-esteem measure, a locus of control measure and a self-esteem measure. And they found that someone who goes to college versus just having 12 years of education or less in the United States, that boosts, they made a causal claim of 0.3 standard deviation increase in locus of control, internal control, and a 0.7 standard deviation increase in self-esteem. No other study has such a treatment effect, but the treatment really goes from setting up someone at university versus someone who just manages to finish high school or even drops out. Please do not give up on me. So I can talk freely, but maybe someone can fix this for me while I continue. Oh, it's shut down. So it's definitely here. The computer is here.
That's just gone orange. Do we need to press that button?
Oh, you think a timer on there? If you don't move it?
No, there is. Pretty short timer.
On the screen there should be a little thing here. It's kind of little screen. Just press it.
Oh, here we go. It's coming back up.
Perfect. So while this is coming back up, I know what I want to say about this slide. So allow me to. Shouldn't have pressed the button so quickly. Oh, we're back. Fantastic. So, it's there, but not there. Yeah, fantastic. So the other aspect is that some of these reforms, some of these papers evaluated, for instance, a learning intensity reform. So these 2, 5 and 6 are studies which evaluated by shortening high school education from 13 years in Germany to 12 years, but keeping the curriculum the same. So it put a little bit of pressure on these students. And 2 different studies, one working only with one state in Germany and the other one working with a nationally representative sample from all German states, or Länder as we call them, and they find very opposing impacts. These ones here are not significant, but they find opposing impacts, for instance, of neuroticism. One study says neuroticism actually went down, the other one says neuroticism went up. In the national representative study, it says neuroticism went up, and they said, look, you just pressured these kids quite heavily, and they also said extraversion went up, the extraversion scores, because they had to deal more with their tutors and they were just more pressured. So that's what you get. But this is, of course, I mean, it's important to know this for the policymaker, what happens to this one cohort that was affected by this. But that's what we learned. And the second interesting bit was, who's familiar with the charter schools? So the charter schools are, I think one person was, in the United States. These are schools that target especially children from lower SES backgrounds. They give them scholarships, and some of them are zero tolerance schools, so they really train you on these non-cognitive skills. Hard work, persistence, grit, training, sit exams all the time. Just practice all of these softer skills to make it into college. And there's one study from Boston and one from New York, the Promise Academy, and they both find these negative treatment effects on the big 5 personality traits and grit. And this was very bizarre. And Marty West in Harvard, who's an education specialist, who evaluated the Boston charter schools, argued in his 2016 article, well, he thinks that the reference point changes as these kids go into these charter schools. So this was a perfect natural experiment because the kids were admitted to the charter schools by a lottery. Because there was just a limited number of spaces, there's a lottery, and some kids just make it and some kids don't. So this was the control group. And so he argues that as kids go into the charter schools and then they're hammered into their brain, you must work hard and the way you work is just not worth anything and you have to work harder, they change their reference point. And since these are self-assessed measures, you can get these negative treatment effects, okay? And then there's a couple of other interesting interventions, none of which had really a really big impact on these non-cognitive skills. The only one that is promising is Becoming a Man, a Chicago public school system intervention that targeted, that targeted adolescents who were in trouble of dropping out of high school. They gave them cognitive behavioral therapy. They did not have a proper measure of non-cognitive skills, but they had a behavioral proxy via suspensions, and there's an increase an increase in this positive behavioral proxy of 1.15 standard deviations. And I would really recommend to you to look at the studies by Sarah Heller, Becoming a Man. This is one of the most innovative school setting interventions. And here, what I haven't talked about is, here is our study I will talk about now today. We find some positive impacts, some of which are not statistically significant and others that are statistically significant on some non-cognitive skills. And I go into detail now of that. I skipped this in the interest of time. We started looking at the role of university education in non-cognitive skill development because in the last 3 to 4, maybe 5 years, there has been a huge public interest in figuring out what is it that universities should teach to prepare the students for a globalizing world, a changing labor market, of an increase in artificial intelligence. What are the skill sets that these students should learn? And Laura Papineau wrote in 2014 in the New York Times an article of how do you learn to think outside the box? And maybe this is what the university should be doing. And you know, the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences quest also to have these interdisciplinary modules, so for instance sending students to the Westmead campus, is exactly this idea, let them think outside the box. And there's so once you Google, you know, in The Guardian and in the New York Times, you find many of these articles. Friedman has written in the New York Times in 2015, I think, also in 2014, how to get a job at Google. Over 30% who work at Google don't have a university degree anymore. Maybe we overrate grade point averages, maybe it's other things, creativity that these students should have. And this is also a discussion that is run in the UK. So David Doherty wrote in 2012 already, universities must provide society with workers who do not only have the ability to continually learn, to think critically and theoretically, but also to innovate and break the status quo and to navigate in the unstable waters of a global economy. And the Graduate Careers Australia survey, I mean, here's from 2014, they have probably more recent versions now since then, say that employers rank poor or inappropriate academic qualifications or result low as an issue in graduate hiring, while they care about interpersonal and communication skills. And that seems that they're disappointed with these abilities. And or attitude and work ethic and motivation. And is that something that the university can teach? Well, maybe. So what we are doing here in this space is we wanted to test whether Australian universities build non-cognitive skills. And we use data from the Household Income and Labor Dynamics Survey. Who's familiar with the survey? Most of you are. So we could identify a large enough sample of adolescents who haven't gone to university yet and follow them up over 8 years. And we have non-cognitive skill measures at various points of time. And we were especially interested in these differential responses to university education by socioeconomic status, because our idea was that someone who comes from an education disadvantaged background changes the environment most when going to the university. And maybe for them, this university training has most impact because it's the greatest change of what they would have experienced in the home. It's one hypothesis. I'm not saying it's the right hypothesis. So we're testing for this. And we test for the heterogeneity by uni group, so we observe to which uni the individual went and by degree type, and we conduct many, many robustness checks to make sure that our results are not just statistical artifacts. So what we do to identify this is we chose a sample of adolescents aged between 15 and just 19 in wave 5. And we've done this because in wave 5 we measure for the first time the big 5 personality traits in the HILDA. And we wanted to measure these big 5 personality traits just before these individuals potentially go to university. As you will see, there are then already, the 15-year-olds are fine, but some of them only go to universities maybe 2 years later. So we don't have it strictly upon entry. We do have it at some time window between either half a year before, or for some 1 year before, and for others maybe even 2 years before. Okay, and then we follow these individuals between 2005 and 2013, because then these personality traits were reassessed in 2009 and in 2013. So we could identify 575 teenagers for whom complete information was available from, the personality data in 2005 and all other socioeconomic background variables, and then who also had follow-up data in 2013 and information on whether they had a work experience, their health, and life events that happened to them in due course. 33% in this type of sample will either graduate from university or have entered university at some point in time in our sample. And here you will see already where we will go with our definition here. So optimally, we just wanted to look at the graduates, those who graduated, but this will give you also a sample selection, so to speak. It's those individuals who just stay in there. So what we decided then, we do both. We look at those who graduate in the meantime as a treatment, and those who go into university and stay at least for a year, okay, as a second group. And so high SES teenagers, 50% go to university, and low SES teenagers, roughly defined, this is defined via father's occupational class, have a 25% probability to go into university. So I've talked about the big 5 personality data. The quality in the HILDA is very good in international comparison. So there's at least 5 items per personality trait. In other nationally representative surveys, as for instance the BHPS or Understanding Society or the German Socioeconomic Panel, they only have 3 items per personality trait. And that reduces the amount of variation that you can get. So this is better in an international comparison. So the treatment I've talked about, so it's a binary indicator of whether the individual attained a degree during the time period that we follow up, or stayed at least for 1 year. So we could do this because we did this because we thought even in a year you probably learned something at university, some exposure. Okay, and then we have a series of control variables like age, gender, country of birth, living in a non-major urban area. There's all these life events that you can observe between 2005 and 2013, all sorts of family, health, and employment-related life events. The work experience, health outcomes, and quite detailed information about the parent's socioeconomic status, and very good, the exact university where the individual went to. So there is an identification problem here, and we choose statistical methods to deal with them. I give you here 3 scenarios. One of the scenarios is the real treatment effect that we're interested in. What you see here is the timeline, pre-university, entering potentially university, after university. And we're interested here in scenario 1. So the individuals, the blue line is, let's say, the control group against whom we want to compare. The adolescents who look very similar to those who go to university but never go to university. We don't have a natural experiment, but I tell you in a second how we do this. But optimally, we want to be interested, they start all at the same non-cognitive skill level. You follow them. At some point, the treatment group, the red line here, then goes to university and then gets some positive, some stimulation of the non-cognitive skills. And then they grow in the non-cognitive skill. And then after uni, you see this gap, and this would be the treatment effect. But it could be that the treatment group starts already at the beginning at a higher level of non-cognitive skills. And you do see this in the data. You see, for instance, that kids who go to university start already with much higher conscientiousness level. It's like college readiness. And even if they have the same trends, you would see later here the gap. So you can't just compare afterwards these differences. Or even worse, it's not only that these kids who will go to university start at a higher level, they may have been already, before they enter university, at a higher growth trajectory. And these are the things that we have to control for. And fourth, where you don't see an extra line, but it could be because we don't observe the non-cognitive skills exactly when they leave a university. We would need an exit survey from students at the university. We don't have that. But as they leave university, they could have chosen, maybe they still were here, but they got a job, a much more stimulating job, working maybe for a consulting firm, which is very pressuring on them in building their skills and their abilities, and that's what pushed them up. And this is what we need to control for. Okay. There are some statistical models. I don't want to delve too much into this, but I want to tell you one thing. So Todd and Wopin, they were both at University of Pennsylvania, have developed statistical models to study non-cognitive and cognitive skill developments of children over the life course. And they have devised what is called the added value model, where you say you observe here the personality trait at some point in time, and you want to know whether university education has a causal impact on this. But then maybe in the error term, what you don't observe is, every investment that this kid has received before it goes to university, and that may be linked to university education. So you pick up all of this unobserved measures with a lagged value of non-cognitive skills. And we have that pre-university non-cognitive skills. And they could be a sufficient statistic for all the investments that the child has gotten up to this point, that also determines whether they go to university. Think of the parent who creates a very stimulating environment in the home, trains, for instance, certain cognitive and non-cognitive skills, but that parent also say it would be great if you went to university. Okay, and that's what we want to control for, and we can. We have a measure of father's occupational class, some other control variables that I have introduced before, some control variables that were measured pre-university, and then an error term. And as long as you assume that whatever is left over in the error term does no longer systematically correlate with the university education, you can interpret this alpha that gives you the correlation between university education on the non-cognitive skills. You can interpret this as an unbiased measure. Or you can also say as a causal bias. It's a very strong assumption. In an extension to this model, we also include an interaction term between father's occupational class and university education to get an extra effect to show whether this is a moderator for this impact of university education. And in a second model, we take first differences to a first difference model just to purge out from the model all time invariant unobserved confounders that we hadn't controlled for in here. And in a third model that I'm not showing you here, we have also matching models. You may know these coarse and exact matching models by Gary King, or the whole matching literature. We also re-estimate all of this, but with the matching method, but I'm not showing this today. What I want to show you here is the following. What you see here is just descriptive statistics over time of extroversion and agreeableness. And I start here. So this is extroversion on the original score, so higher is more sociable, in year 2005, 9, and 13. And those squares are non-university students, students who will never go to university. And the triangles are those who will go to university. And what you see is that those who will never go to university start at a much higher level of extroversion. They're much more sociable. But over these 8 years, they drop quite significantly. And those who go to university, they have a slight upward trend. And this graph here shows you already the key result of our paper. This is just raw. It's just raw statistics. In this treatment effect, we want to know whether this treatment effect here still holds when we do the proper statistical modeling, and it does. I will show you in a second. And agreeableness, we see that the children who will go to university, they pre-university have much higher levels of agreeableness than those who will not go to university. Both of them have a similar trend going over the next 8 years, but in 2013, when these ones here, for instance, have finished their university, they are no different from each other. They started at slightly higher levels, but no significant difference, and they end up at a higher level. So it looks like university education didn't do anything to them. But when you look down at socioeconomic groups,
Would you assume that those who didn't enter university entered the workforce?
Yeah, they entered the workforce. So we have tried to identify this. They've either entered the workforce or they went for some TAFE education, so a certificate 3 or 4. And I think in some of the specifications we try to differentiate also, what's in the control group, those who do this or the other. And I think we dropped this in the end because the sample size became too small and there was no obvious differences. So we may have mentioned it in the paper, but we discarded in the end from this.
But they entered
They did something. We discussed this quite carefully in the paper. They did something, and this is important because optimally you would like to compare the kids only against those who wanted to go to uni and just didn't do it, just missed out. Like the ATA, if we had the ATA scores, we could just use those who, for instance, just made the cutoff, just over, and those who just didn't make it and therefore didn't go to university. That would be the optimal control group, but we don't have that. But when you look at this, so the agreeableness, and in the interest of time, what we do see is that this is now different by university status and socioeconomic status of the parents, dichotomized, roughly higher occupational class and lower. And what you do see is those kids who will go to uni and come from high SES backgrounds, they start with pretty high levels of agreeableness. They're well trained, they're polite, they're social, they pay into the social good, which is good news. And much higher than every other group. But as 8 years come in, those kids who come from low SES but will go to university, look at their growth trajectory. They end up highest in the end. And they all have slight growth trajectories, but it's this treatment effect that we're identifying, this one here. High SES kids who will go to uni versus low SES kids who will go to uni, and this is the treatment effect. And later I will show you, in a second, this will even persist when we do the proper statistical modeling, but you do see this already in the raw data. We don't see anything on the other non-cognitive skills, so in the interest of time, I will just continue now with the proper adjustment. So what you see here is a model, the value-added model by Todd and Wolpin that we had used in other papers as well. You see here the results for every non-cognitive skills, the impact of university education relative to either working or going to TAFE, expressed in standard deviation differences from the mean. So what you see here is in a model, you only see something in a model without interaction effects between uni and the socioeconomic status of the parents. Children who go to uni come out with 0.3 standard deviations higher extroversion. the same impact you find for boys and girls. So it doesn't matter which gender, which sex. If you do an interaction effect with father's occupational prestige score, you don't find any significant interaction effect. Okay? And you see, on average, nothing for agreeableness. But you see, once you have an interaction effect, what this means here is that the agreeableness scores are on average 0. And we've seen this in the graph. But children whose fathers are 1 standard deviation above the mean, so this just enters technicians and then professionals and managers, they have much lower agreeableness scores after they entered university of 0.23 standard deviations. Whereas children who come from low SES backgrounds, so whose fathers are at least 1 standard deviation below the occupational ladder, they have the 0.23 standard deviation higher agreeableness scores. And when you calculate the marginal effect from these adolescents at high and low, you would see that the kids from high SES backgrounds score 0.21 standard deviation below after university, and the kids from low SES 0.24. So you can probably say, oh yeah, this is just a continuous interaction. We've done a lot of robustness checks to this to estimate this non-parametrically or to dichotomize or make an ordinal measure of these father occupational prestige scores, and this holds no matter what we do. And I could show you if we have time. We do the same with the fixed effects model, and we see exactly the same, roughly the same estimate, a little bit smaller. This is very common in these fixed effects models on extraversion, and the same type of interaction effect for agreeableness. So we find the same then when we use coarsened exact matching. The heterogeneity by gender or by sex, I have talked about this. I can jump over this. And then we also did the same by university groups and degrees. We didn't have enough observations to look, for instance, the causal impact of University of Sydney. We just, there's like a handful of kids in there. But we grouped them by group of 8, by the ATN network, by the IRU, RUN, and other universities. So for instance, Wollongong and Deakin universities would be in here. Very research-intensive universities, but that haven't joined any other. And roughly a third are in group of 8 universities. And we also know the field of study, STEM fields, medicine and health-related education management, and others. And so we can do this at least in the levels. We have enough observations with the value-added model. What you see is now the treatment effect separate by group of 8, the ATN, the IRU, and the RUN networks and other universities. And first what we do is, so the treatment effects are not statistically significant for all these universities, but we did a test, small sample sizes now, okay? We did a test, an F test on the equality of all of these coefficients, that they're all the same, and we failed to reject this test. This is the p-value down there. So this 0.281 is really no different than the 0.282 from the ATN, or the 0.147 or the 0.356. So this has prompted us to say, well, this is a generic treatment effect of university education. It's not, you could say maybe these are the high quality universities because they put a lot of pride into their teaching and the research activeness of their research staff. They don't give more in extroversion skills than other universities. Which one are the ones now forgotten? Which ones are the ones that were made from polytechniques into like RMIT? Is that the RUN network? Now forgotten. I should know. Sorry. So some of these. So what prompts are? Do you know?
I think it is RUN.
Yeah, I think so too. So what prompted? So then when we saw this, we thought, oh, you know what? Maybe it's the exposure, just simple exposure to university life, and it protects you from going into the grind of the labor market and being accountable to a boss, and it extends your adolescence by a little bit longer. And so it's the exposure. And when we take a measure of exposure to university life or non-cognitive skill development, then we see also every extra year gives you a little bit more of non-cognitive skill development. And in levels, we don't see anything happening as before. I mean, there's something here significant. These group of 8 universities are quite good in increasing openness to experience, but all of these are no different from each other, and it's only one significant effect. If you test it for multiple hypotheses, small samples, it probably will go away, so we don't want to make a big deal about this. And by degree type, it's very similar. Again, we tested so the extroversion effect, it's there for almost all degrees, maybe strongest for STEM, but they also enter with the lowest sociability scores. But when you do a test again on all of these, equality of coefficients, there's no difference in that. Maybe if we tested this one versus that one, management and law, maybe that's a statistical difference. But overall, the big picture remains. So we did so many robustness checks. We used a different matching method. We did non-parametric estimation of this interaction effect. I could show you if you wanted to see. Restrict the sample only to the graduates. Then the results become a bit stronger. Those who graduate. Test for length of exposure and alternative definitions of a parental socioeconomic status. So the conclusions: University of Education Australia builds important social skills. So extroversion and agreeableness for low SES children. These are skills that society and the labor market values. So agreeableness is a skill where you would say people would pay into a public good, or they would collaborate in a game or in a negotiation. No one has really written about this, but I think I'm tempted to write about this. We were very much sitting on the fence of saying this too explicitly in the paper, but the journalists have asked us about this. Is this something that we should be building? And if I'm honest about this, I'm thinking, in the workplace you'd rather have agreeable people around you, not too agreeable, but kind of. And
aren't they saying that's the future of the workplace, is you need people who can quickly form and work in collaborative groups rather than competitiveness?
Exactly.
That's going to be
exactly
skills that are needed for the future.
So Jack Ma said recently, so he's the founder of the, I think is it called Alibaba or? Yeah, and he said that with the rise of artificial intelligence, human beings have to be trained in skills where AI doesn't have a comparative advantage, and one of these is team building, empathy. So he talks a lot about empathy, and this is what we really should teach our students, because this is not where the machine has a comparative advantage. But I may disagree with this, because you can train maybe a robot to react to emotions, maybe even better than a human being. But let's talk about this another time. So it looks like it's the general exposure to university education, so that you're just, you can extend this adolescence a little bit longer, play a little bit longer. The way how university degrees are structured, you have to talk a lot to each other and collaborate in teams. So we think this is what's happening. Yeah, and degree-specific contents or university quality does not seem to be the mechanism through which this is happening. Yeah, and then of course we conclude university education is just more than pushing people into higher paid jobs or raising their lifetime, their permanent income. So does someone know what's the permanent income increase of a university degree in Australia? Gross and net?
Isn't it 10,000 per year of education?
Yeah, roughly, but you could, so it depends on what numbers you look, but so the official numbers say something 220,000 gross. Then you take the tuition fees off for this, so maybe 150,000, so your mortgage, I know, parts of your mortgage. Of course, there's great variation, but we think that there's very important social skills, as very societal returns to these. This is not what I want to show you. So we had, and this is maybe how you figure out that this is happening, we had, these are just some media outlets that had covered this. We were very surprised because it took us a long time to publish this, to make the claim that this is causal. And so we had jumped through a lot of hoops, but then the media took this up. Even the Marginal Revolution has now discussed this, so we're quite happy with the outcome. I'm open to debates. Thank you.